All right, good morning. We're going to be reading this morning just a brief passage from Matthew 7, verses 24 through 27. Against Matthew 7, 24 through 27. This is the wise and the foolish builders. It's the end of the Sermon on the Mount. So again, Matthew 7, 24 through 27. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the stream rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash.
So what about wise and foolish builders? The illustration is simple enough. Being the Lord's disciple, which involves receiving Jesus' teachings and being obedient to them, can be compared to one's making wise choices about the building of a house. We know this illustration well, particularly those of us who went to vacation Bible school when we were children. You know, we won't sing it today, but you remember the song and the action that goes with it. Specifically, it's important to choose wisely regarding the foundation for the house. The rock and the sand are extremes in an array of choices that one might make in the building of a house. The same house can be built on the rock or it can be built on the sand. They'll look the same, they will be the same functionally, and the differences between the two will not be discernible until they have to stand up to the forces of nature. The winds are going to blow, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully. The floodwaters are going to rise and fall. And over time, when this happens, the difference between these two structures will emerge. The house built on the rock will stand. The house built on the sand will collapse. Also, it's worth noting that the collapse of the house built on the sand is not going to be some random, ordinary event that we can take in stride. It's going to be dramatic. It's going to be a great crash with disastrous consequences for the builder and for those dwelling in the house. We live in an older, established neighborhood not too far from here. And what this has come to mean is that would-be home buyers in this neighborhood may be far less interested in the vintage houses that we and our neighbors live in than they are in the potential for what the lot may hold for a much larger, grander vision for a house that they might have. I've had the opportunity to witness some of these building projects, and some of them have gone quite well, but I've had a front row seat at a couple of them lately that have just gone on and on and on, due in part at least to poor decision making early on. I can't say for certain that there are any great crashes that are going to occur in my neighborhood in the future, but you never know. Matthew's gospel concludes this body of teaching that we call the Sermon on the Mount with this illustration about the importance of choosing a proper foundation for building a house. This is not meant to be a lesson on constructing a house, but an illustration of a core teaching about building our lives before God on a proper foundation. We do indeed have a choice in this matter. We can build upon one foundation or another. But choosing a foundation that rejects Jesus' teachings only leads to destruction. Now, it would appear that we as an assembly of God's people already have a handle on this. This kind of language is already reflected in our discussions about faith and obedience. And also, one need not look any further than some of our familiar songs and hymns that address this. Let me give you a couple of examples. There's the hymn, "How Firm a Foundation." We sang it just a couple of Sundays ago. "How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in God's excellent word. What more can be said to you God hath said, to you who for refuge to Jesus have fled? Fear not, I am with thee. Oh, be not dismayed, for I am thy God, and will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand upheld by my righteous, omnipotent hand. Or what about this one? My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he still is all my hope and stay. And then one more. There stands a rock on shores of time that rears to heaven its head sublime. That rock is cleft, and they are blessed who find within this cleft a rest. Some build their hopes on the ever-drifting sand, some on their fame or their treasure or their land. Mine's on a rock that forever will stand. Jesus, the rock of ages. This morning I want to look briefly at this illustration about wise and foolish builders in its context. Jesus says, therefore everyone who hears these words and puts them into practice is like a wise man, and the rest of that. Specifically, though, to which words is he referring? Is he referring to all of his words, or just some of them, or just things that are explicit commands, or does it include things that could be inferred to be binding upon us? And certainly, we need to be receptive to and obedient to all that has been revealed to us in the Scriptures. It may not be words of Jesus specifically, but it's all gospel. For this morning, though, I want to look at this illustration of the wise man and the foolish man in the context of this specific body of teaching. As we noted, it comes at the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount as recorded in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. Of course, this sermon abounds with many, many things that are worthy of detailed study. I would mention as an aside that this year's Vacation Bible School, you saw the slide in the early part of our assembly today, it's going to be, it's being planned for August 6th, and it's being developed on this theme from this prominent section of Matthew's Gospel. So stay tuned to more information about that. But for today, I want to draw just four major points about building upon the solid foundation of Jesus' teaching that are worthy for our attention. If Mike were here, he would say, I have just 4 points, and then we'll be done. So 4 points, and then we'll be done. In illustrating these points, I'm going to let the text of the sermon speak for itself. So if you want to open your Bibles, we will track through it by the order that it is in the text. So if you'd like to open to Matthew chapter 5, we'll do our best to try to treat this as an open Bible study. So the first point, I would say, speaks to might be considered the dominant characteristic of building upon the rock. And this reflects the desire to be, an abiding desire to be God's people. Those who do so, who build on the rock, possess this desire, this passion to have their lives in tune with God's will. We see this in the opening section of Matthew chapter 5, which we call the Beatitudes. And then following that section of text, we see it further amplified in the sections dealing with salt and light. But first, the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes exhort us that true happiness and contentment with God are to be found by those who are poor in spirit, those that mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, the merciful, those who are pure in heart, those who are persecuted because of righteousness. And then the section about the salt and light, beginning with 5:13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Did you ever wonder what this meant? I mean, I don't like my salt, so I'm just going to throw it out in the street. Well, we wouldn't do that. We might throw it on the sidewalk to melt ice in the wintertime. But the reference here is using old salt for paving material. Just throw it out on a rocky path, maybe dusty path, and it provides a sort of paving material. But the point is, when it's you can do that with it because it's not of any use for its savor any longer. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So this first point about an abiding desire to be God's people. Secondly, Jesus' teachings call us to a higher form of righteousness. Those who would be his disciples need to have a higher form of righteousness, higher than what was characteristic of the religious leaders of Jesus' day. For us, perhaps it's a higher form of righteousness than some things we might have traditionally been taught. As the text will say, we'll get there in a moment, that this is something that's fundamental to the fulfillment of the law itself. It takes traditional teachings about morality and ethics and elevates them to a higher plane. We sang a song about higher ground a minute ago. This is part of the spiritual development of God's people, that their understanding and their passion for God's word is continually brought to a level that's higher. In several examples, Jesus tells them that they can't believe everything that they were taught growing up. So let's look at this section of the text. We're at 5:20 right now. For I tell you that unless your righteousness exceed that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not inherit the kingdom of heaven. Well, Jesus, what do you mean by that? Well, he gives some examples. What about murder? You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. What about adultery? They came and asked Jesus about adultery and the consequences of adultery on other occasions. But he says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. What about vengeance? What about getting even? You've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Well, you and I know that this is not the way the world operates. I grew up in a government office culture, worked in the defense business, and the mantra there in many circumstances was the saying that no shot goes unanswered. You know, if someone fires across your bow, you just don't ignore it. You answer. You let them know that you heard you, and you answer. Well, I said, Jesus is taking things that people heard, that people became part of their religious culture, and elevating their thinking to a higher plane. A related one is, how do we feel about enemies? You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? So this second point, Jesus calls us to a higher form of righteousness. Third is this business of ostentatiousness. Our religion is not something that we do for show. We're not about trying to look good. Instead, we do what we do for God's glory and to receive the reward that he gives. We don't give to the needy so that we'll look good to others, because we give to the needy. Our prayers are not to be ostentatious displays of piety for the benefit of others to see us. Chapter 6, verse 1, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. The word hypocrite comes from Greek words that mean play actors. You all may have seen reenactments of some of the older Greek tragedies, and where they didn't have elaborate costumes, but they would have a mask that was on a wand, and when they wanted to be a certain character, they would hold that wand up to their face and speak their line. And the person that was answering them would have another mask held up to their face, so they became characters. Later on in the plays, the same actors might come back with a different mask to be a different character. So, but our religious expression, our prayers, our deeds are not to be done with the idea that we're putting on a mask and pretending to be something that we're not, of being hypocrites. As a final point, I want to talk about the teaching that discipleship involves trust and obedience. Remember the old song we used to sing growing up, trust and obey, for there's no other way? We don't sing that so often anymore, but it's still in our book, and maybe we should. But it used to be an invitation song, as I recall, that we would, something that would encourage people to come and to place their trust in the Lord and place a premium on the importance of being obedient to him. Trust and obey. The point is that discipleship is more than just agreeing with what somebody says or giving lip service to what somebody says. Jesus said at one point that the people, they gave him honor with their lips, but their hearts were far from him. More than lip service, discipleship demands trust and obedience. We trust in the Lord to preserve and to protect our spiritual treasure. We trust him to provide for our physical needs. Entry into the kingdom comes not through sentiment that we have or intellectual agreement that we said, or just saying, yeah, I think those are good teachings. I support that. But it's through faith. It's a faith that not only agrees, but it's a faith that is obedience. 6:19. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. 25. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. I need to take you back to my house for just a minute. One of our favorite parts of living there is stocking the multiple bird feeders we have in our backyard. So when I do that, it can be just a matter of minutes where all different varieties of flying fowl show up, and they really go after it. And on the ground, there are the squirrels and the chipmunks that clean up for what they drop from the feeders. But the point is, God, through our efforts, is taking care of them. They don't have to worry about that. So why should we worry that he will not take care of us? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Then there's this business of the narrow and the wide gates. 7:13. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. Many enter through it, but small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Again, dealing with lip service, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So we have these 4 points. But why this sermon today? For this church, in this season, why speak of building a house on a solid foundation and this spiritual analogy to faith and obedience to the Lord's teaching? The theme, of course, is of timeless importance to all who would be the Lord's disciples, yet it seems particularly relevant to our current circumstances. To say that we are in a period of transition would be an understatement. As a church, we're in the process of emerging from a pandemic that affected virtually every aspect of church life: worship, preaching and teaching, fellowship, ministry. It was all affected. We are now involved in the task of reconstituting these vital activities for today and for tomorrow in ways that take account of new realities. God will surely lead us in this effort, but for our part, we must be prayerful and thoughtful about the way forward. How best to meet the needs of our people to grow spiritually? How best to nurture our young people? How best to serve our aging members? How best to develop and maintain a vibrant fellowship? How best to reach lost souls? We're also addressing turnover in our paid staff. If you just woke up, we're doing that, and I think this is something that is well known. After more than 2 decades of remarkable stability in our staff, we now find ourselves in the process of seeking those who will come here to help take on vital roles in helping us grow in the knowledge and in the love of God and in our commitment to discipleship and to service. Does this process look and feel the same way that it did in the 1990s when last we were so engaged? In some ways it does, but in other ways perhaps not. Again, God will lead us through all of this, but there is an important part that we must play through prayer and planning and thoughtful action. As we address these and other challenges for the present and the future, we should bear in mind that today's golden text about wise and foolish builders remains relevant. Truly, we are continuing to build a house, and our commitment to making wise choices about foundational matters remains vitally important. There are other foundations that we could choose, choices other than the foundation of faith and obedience to the Lord. For instance, we might be tempted to choose what is expedient, what makes us comfortable, what lines up with what we've always been taught, what would help us get along, what would help us stay in step with the latest thinking. Rather than building upon these questionable foundations, may we choose wisely. Choose the firm foundation, the solid rock. It's not an easy choice. It's a choice that calls us to be something of God's design and to live in a particular way that He has prescribed. It involves a sincere desire to be God's people, to hunger and thirst after His righteousness, to be His salt and light. It involves a higher form of righteousness, more than a legalistic concern with external matters, and with commitment to true teachings that sin begins in the heart, that murder is rooted in hatred, that adultery begins with lust, that justice is not about returning eye for an eye. Enemies are not to be treated with contempt. It involves living righteously, not to be seen by others, but so that God may be glorified. Our prayers are not a pretense that we are something that we are not, but an expression of genuine hearts that seek the Father's reward. Finally, it involves the pursuit of true discipleship, a life that places trust in the Lord day by day and holds obedience to Him above all else. It builds up treasures in heaven, not in temporal things. It shuns endless worry about physical needs. It does not follow the crowd on the road to destruction. It honors God, not with lip service, but with obedience to His will. Dear church, as we go forward, as we rebuild, we seek new opportunities for growth, let us take hold of the Master's illustration about wise and foolish builders. May we be wary of alternative foundations that may seem expedient, but which lead to our abandonment of our first love and ultimately to ruin. Instead, may we build upon the rock of trusting faith and obedience to His teaching, so that the house we build, with His aid, may stand firm against the destructive powers of the evil one.